All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm not used to that attention. I have a toddler at home, and whenever I say good morning, I am mostly met with just more, I need this, I need this, I need this. So thank you all so much. That was very refreshing. I want to welcome you all to the 2024 Lincoln Ideas Forum. My name is Callie Hawkins, and I'm the CEO and Executive Director of President Lincoln's Cottage. We're so grateful to those of you who are joining us this morning, both inside the cottage and virtually. And I want to say a special thank you to our Team Lincoln members whose annual gifts help preserve the cottage and make programs like this possible. We rely on our members to support our mission, and members also receive a variety of benefits, such as discounted tour tickets, early access to special events and programs, discounts in our museum shop, and much more. So if you're not already a member or you need to reserve or renew your membership today, you can do that online or in person. We have a table set up just outside. We've made it as easy as possible for folks to join us. I also want to thank our team of really incredible staff here at the cottage, especially Cameron Walpole, who put together such an incredible lineup of speakers. And Cameron here. This was really Cameron's brainchild, and she put together a thoughtful and timely presentation, and I'm just so delighted that you all have joined us for this. Our team is whip smart and so curious, and it really shows in all of the work that we do, and today is evidence of that. Abraham Lincoln and his family lived here from June to November of 1862, 63, and 64. In total, about a quarter of his presidency. And while living here, he thought about the war, and some of his most critical decisions were made, including the Emancipation Proclamation, which was conceived of in this very room. But the decisions that he made as president can't be separated from the range of universal human experiences he also had here. In this place, triumph and tragedy, deep sorrow, and transcendent joy coexist in every room. Lincoln's humanity looms large at the cottage, and it's in the exploration of this aspect of Lincoln's life that we as an organization do our best work. 362 days a year, we lead tours of this cottage and invite visitors to spend time with a different side of Lincoln. Visitors discover a pragmatist and politician, yes, but they also meet a seeker, a president, a person who sought deeper feeling and meaning, whose human authenticity was palpable and memorable. Today is a reflection of that, as is the convening we held just 2 months ago, which brought together museum professionals, social scientists, and academic historians to strategize ways that museums and historic sites can infuse America's 250th, which is coming up in 2026. It's also, you may hear it be referred to as the semi-quincentennial, which I purposely left out, but just thought I'd throw in there because I do know how to pronounce it. With a heart towards humanity, compassion, and belonging at a time when our nation so desperately needs it. I'm so humbled by the fact that that incredible program introduced us to two of our speakers today. Abraham Lincoln last visited the cottage on April 13th, 1865, the day before his assassination. We don't know the content of the conversations he had here that day, but it's likely he was making plans to return with his family a few short weeks later. The way I interpret this is that Lincoln never officially closed the door on the cottage for the last time, which to me means that he left it open for all of us to consider the contemporary resonance of the unfinished work or lasting legacies of what he was thinking through, or even of his way of being here at the cottage. It was in this spirit that the Lincoln Ideas Forum was developed. And each year for the past 9, we've marked the anniversary of Lincoln's last visit by inviting speakers working in contemporary fields related to the ideas he was thinking through here. Over the last few decades, many industries have tried to determine where they fit in a world where so much work can be automated. Now in 2024, even our creative work can be done by machines. But can it be done well? Or, perhaps a more disturbing question, can it be done better? Today, we've gathered experts in the fields of clinical and social psychology, creative writing, theology, and art, not to answer any of these questions, but to ask them. What does it mean to be human? Why do we value authenticity in human relationships? Can we embrace both AI and authenticity? I'm so grateful to all of the incredible speakers who are here to explore this with us today. Thank you all so much. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Justin Hopkins. We had the pleasure of working with Dr. Hopkins a couple months ago, and we were so taken with him. And I told him this morning, Cameron and I hadn't even left the parking lot before we were trying to figure out how we were going to work with him again. So you all are the beneficiaries of that conversation. We're just so thrilled to be joined by Dr. Hopkins, who is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalytic scholar in Washington, D.C. He is the owner and founder of Hopkins Behavioral Health, a BIPOC-focused therapy practice that specializes in psychoanalytic therapy for adults and couples. Psychoanalytic theory asserts that the human mind is largely subconscious, meaning much of our internal world is hidden from us. And we can become more empowered, fulfilled, and free when we confront subconscious fears informed by past traumas. Dr. Hopkins views therapy as a tool for personal liberation. As a scholar, he employs psychoanalytic theory to illuminate avenues for social and societal liberation. Dr. Hopkins is a sought-after speaker on race and trauma. His insightful and thought-provoking delivery has inspired change in numerous nonprofit organizations, universities, and international law firms. In 2023, Dr. Hopkins was an advisor to the National Trust for Historic Preservation to support their advocacy for the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument. Applying the psychology of trauma to the historical context of race, Dr. Hopkins outlined the pivotal role of historic preservation in healing our nation's wounds. He is committed to addressing the hurt that undergirds our social ills, and he blends his clinical expertise with a passion for humanity to advise and advocate for social change. Dr. Hopkins.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning. Callie, thank you so much for that very warm introduction. I was listening to my bio and I was like, who is that guy? But it's such a pleasure to be joining you all this morning. And it's particularly a pleasure to be back here. When I first came to the Lincoln Cottage, it was by Callie's invitation to be part of a working group of preservationists, historians, and some museum curators. And a group of 20 plus was tasked with imagining how to have an honest commemoration of America as we near its 250th birthday. And as we spent the weekend connecting, reflecting, and brainstorming, thinking about our complex history, there were some common themes that really came out through our work. First, we wanted people to feel seen in the telling of the American story. Second, we only wanted true stories to be told. And third, when visiting exhibits, it was important to all of us that people felt something. Not that they would just come and take in the information, digest some rote knowledge, but that something would actually resonate deep within. Our hope was that people could have this visceral connection to the joys and sorrows, the atrocities and the triumphs that really shape our history. In capturing this complexity, this wide spectrum of experience, I think we were really getting at this concept of authenticity, this concept of something that feels real on a soul level, not something that's reduced, something simple, but something that you could feel. And to that end, I'm so excited for our theme today, which in some ways feels like a continuation of this conversation that we started. Our theme, Authenticity in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, which is really about what does it mean to be human In a time where technology can replicate our actions and change the way that we live in so many ways, ways that are somewhat unimaginable until now. It's so fitting to be having this conversation in this particular room where the Emancipation Proclamation was written, where the very concept of humanity was deliberated and ultimately expanded to include enslaved Black people. Uh, at the cottage, I think it's also fitting to be having this conversation here because at the cottage, there's this particular approach to doing this kind of work of exploring Lincoln and his family that really humanizes him. I like the way that Callie put it. His humanity really looms large. And visitors often come here and experience what's called the Lincoln Shiver. And for those of you who are not familiar, visitors kind of digest the intimate details of Lincoln's life and the family and these private quarters. They often feel these indescribable sensations, these full body goosebumps, also known as the Lincoln Shiver. And how very human to have such an instinctual reaction when connecting to the stories of history. In fact, we are the only creatures that tell stories in order to understand ourselves better. As a clinical psychologist, that kind of self-understanding is just so very important to me. I think it's like mental gold when you can really understand yourself well. It's a common misconception that as therapists, we tell people how to be happier or how to self-care your way to satisfaction. And but really, we help people come to a deeper understanding of who they are. We help people listen to the sound of the genuine within, to live a more authentic life. To honor what matters most. And it's actually really hard to do that, to be aligned, to be centered, to be really honest with yourself. So honest that that honesty shows up day in and day out on what you devote most of your time to, and what you think mostly about. Our history is complex because we are complex, all of us. So I'm sorry for anyone who had the notion that they were pretty simple or easy, but we're actually all incredibly layered. For example, we have thousands of thoughts in a given hour, and we're only aware of a fraction of them. We often desire mutually exclusive things at the same time. The vast majority of the human mind is subconscious. I mean, anything that you think you know about yourself, you actually only know that in part. And we frequently feel multiple competing emotions at the same time as well. So suffice it to say, authenticity doesn't quite come with simplicity. But my sense is a big part of this human thing is embracing the paradoxes, the contradictions, the joys and the pain, the death and life of life itself, and leaning in to feel everything that is to be felt and taking stock of it all. Indeed, an authentic life is hard to live, but it's in this complexity that there's also so much meaning and so much beauty. And I think our exceptional group of speakers will help us explore that beauty throughout our time today. So, again, I'm so excited to be joining you all. I look forward to continuing our conversation and really together, and then that have a sense of shared belonging in the wrestling. But in the spirit of a forum, after we have our four speakers talk with you all today, we're going to have a community conversation. It won't be like your typical Q&A of question and response to our speakers, but we want to hear from you all, your thoughts, your ideas, what you're wrestling with, and we'll involve our speakers in that conversation as well. So without further ado, our first speaker will be joining us virtually. Her name is Dr. Sheena Iyengar, and she'll be talking about making meaningful choices to spark innovation. Sheena Iyengar is the ST Lee Professor of Business and the Academic Director of the Innovation Hub at the Columbia Business School. She's one of the world's experts on choice and problem solving. I'm so happy she's here. Iyengar is the recipient of the Thinkers 50 2023 Innovation Award and the author of 2 award-winning books: The Art of Choosing, written in 2010, Financial Times Business Book of the Year, Amazon #3 best-selling business book, and Think Bigger, How to Innovate, written in 2023, and that was the Thinkers 50 Top 10 Management Book of 2023. Her recorded TED Talks have received a collective 7 million views, and she regularly appears in top-tier media such as The Wall Street Journal, The Financial Times, The New Yorker, The Economist, Bloomberg Businessweek, CNBC, CNN, the BBC, and NPR. Iyengar is famously recognized for her JAM study, which transformed the way we think about products offered in the marketplace and how we curate them for customers. Iyengar created the Think Bigger method, the innovative thinking and problem solving based on recent advances in neuro and cognitive sciences. Think Bigger concentrates on how creative ideas form in your mind and teaches a 6-step method for innovation. She was ranked by the Thinkers 50 as a top 10 management thinker in 2023. In 2022, she was ranked by the Asian American Business Development Center as one of the 50 outstanding Asian Americans in business. She received the Outstanding Faculty Award from the CBS Executive MBA class of 2021. In 2002, she was the only social scientist to receive the Presidential Early Career Award for scientists and engineers from the Office of the President. She holds a dual degree from the University of Pennsylvania with a BS in economics from the Wharton School and a BA in psychology from the College of Arts and Sciences. She receives her PhD from Stanford University. In her personal life as a blind woman, she intuitively used Think Bigger to find her calling and strives to inspire others to do the same. She'll be joining us virtually today, but I have no doubt her presence will be just as profound. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sheena Iyengar.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so sorry that I can't be there in person. It's a real privilege to speak to such an august community and in such a special room. You can never decide which president is more of my favorite. Washington. Today, what I want to talk about is the answer to the age-old question of how do we create our most authentic self? I'm not going to be able to fully answer it, but I'm hoping to give you some insights. And in particular, I'm also hoping to share with you not only how we can create it, but also how we might begin to consider using aids, we call it AI, but a more directed form of AI to help us in this journey. So I thought it would be apt to start by showing you a picture that was taken in 1971 of the Earth as seen from the moon. After all, it's apt given the day of the eclipse. You know, the first men explored the moon the year I was born in 1969. And so when I was growing up, I was fascinated by space. In fact, when I was growing up, you could often find me on the streets of New York City with my head up, looking up at that light, gauzy blue sky, because I was mesmerized by what was up there. I wanted to grow up to be a part of that sky. I loved it. So much so that I was often not looking where I was going and falling into everything. So when I was in my old teacher, Mrs. Horowitz, once telling us all that we could grow up and do and be whatever it is we wanted to be as long as we put our hearts and minds to it. And so when she asked us the proverbial question, what do you want to be when you grow up? I raised my hand and confidently said that I was going to grow up and become an astronaut. And of course, all the other kids snickered, and the teacher was a little speechless because how could a kid going blind grow up to become an astronaut? That dream was taken off the table. In fact, when I was growing up, there were lots of questions about what I was going to be when I grew up. How was she going to learn how to read and write or do math or get a around or have friends, or what was she going to do with her life? And the questions were endless. And in a way, you might say that that was paralyzing and demoralizing. But on the other hand, it was really useful because it explained to me in very vivid terms what my problems were that I had to solve for. And so, like most of us, as I grew up, I went to the go to strategy to try to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I looked around and said, what options are available to me? And I discovered when I went to Spain, and everywhere I went, people would walk up to me and slap money in my hands and expected me to give them lottery tickets in return. Because apparently, since the time of Franco, the blind had cornered the lottery ticket market. When I was in places like Japan and other parts of Asia, random people would walk up to me, including in the subway, and take my hands and place it on their shoulders and backs and expected me to perform these magical massages. When I was in high school, I remember my guidance counselor once saying that he didn't have to show me the college manual because I, like most blind people, would end up on SSI and SSDI. But then there was the music teacher who had a lot of faith in my abilities. He handed me a clarinet and assumed that I would become the next Ray Charles or Stevie Wonder. Then, when it was discovered that I really didn't have any musical talent to speak of, then people decided that maybe I could go to college. And what I was going to be when I grew up was obvious to everybody other than me. Just become a lawyer, they said. Justice is blind. While all of these options were certainly interesting, the big question that kept circling in my mind was did I really have to settle for the meager options put before me? I wanted more choice. I wanted to dream, but I didn't know how. Of course, we're all told, particularly during a graduation speech, that you can grow up and do whatever it is you want to be. All you have to do is dream. So I said, enough of these meager options. I was going to dream, and I was going to dream bigger. And I went to college, and there I began to explore all kinds of possibilities. Well, I imagined myself traipsing up and down the New York Stock Exchange wearing a miniskirt and high heels, and I was going to determine the price of so many different major corporations. Or I was going to become a brain surgeon and cut open people's brains and really figure out how our minds worked. Or I was going to become an archaeologist and explore cultures from distant pasts and discover all kinds of things about our culture and the way we have lived and can live today. And of course, the dream of being an astronaut was always there. But one by one, I began to realize that none of these dreams were possible. At least not then. I didn't know how to solve the various constraints that each of these dreams were associated with, and so they had to be taken off the table. And so then the question is, what do you do? Right? Because we're often told that a big part of growing up is putting aside your dreams and stick them in a tiny corner of your mind and learn that part of growing up is accepting what's in front of you and being happy with that. Is that what I needed to do? Or the other thing we're told is to dream big, and it's only if you believe in yourself that you can make it true. But somehow both pieces of advice seemed rather just not enough, not satisfying enough for me. And so I began to do the other thing that we often tell ourselves, right? In order to be your authentic self, you're supposed to reflect and reflect and reflect, and maybe go to a retreat or climb a mountain or take a long walk on the beach. And that way you'll find yourself. And so I reflected. And I asked myself, well, what can I be? What is it that I want to be? I found that reflection alone couldn't answer the question of what could I be. But where reflection did help me was it answered the question, what is it? Why is it that I really wanted to be an astronaut or be on the New York Stock Exchange or an archaeologist or a brain surgeon? What was it about looking up at that gauzy blue sky, which I could no longer see, but I still vividly remember? What did it stand for? What did I really want? What were my underlying desires? The great German writer and statesman Goethe once wrote in his piece, he wrote a treatise on the nature, function, and psychology of color. And he wrote about the color blue. And he said that blue was like the contradiction between excitement and repose. Just as the upper sky and distant mountains appear blue, so too does a blue surface seem to retire away from us. Just as we like to readily follow an agreeable object as it's flying away from us, so too do we love to contemplate blue, not as it's advancing towards us, but as we but because we like to draw after it. So maybe the real reason why I wanted to be all of those things had to do with my desire to find a career that would enable me to experience the dual feelings of excitement and repose, that would enable me to experience that sense of vastness, freedom, contentment, respect, all those things that are associated with the compilation of the various dreams that I had. And so now that I knew what I wanted, now began my search. How do I actually create the embodiment or find the embodiment of what those desires really were? And now I had to start to look outside of me, not just inside of me. And so I picked up the phone when I was 22 years old. In fact, back then I was in Washington, D.C. And during my summer internship, every evening I would call all these graduates from psychology programs. And I would ask them, well, what did you do after your PhD? And I was just collecting options. I could become an HR consultant. I could become a management consultant, an HR director, a web designer. I could become a jury consultant. And I'm looking at these. Okay, Sheena, you're probably not going to be hired to be a jury consultant or to aesthetically design thing that could I do? Maybe consultant, maybe this professor thing. Maybe I could create something that could enable me to experience those desires. As Bob Dylan once said, life isn't about finding yourself. It's not about finding anything, really. Life is about creating yourself. And so I began to create myself. And in so doing, I began to realize that what I could do was study choice, study how to get the most from choice, and in so doing, empower myself and others to get the most from choice. Were there other people, blind people, at studying choice? No, but nobody said you couldn't do it, and I couldn't find any barrier that prevented me from doing it. So where does the power of choice come from? The power of choice comes from two things. It comes from your ability to pick and find. And it comes from your ability to pair your imagination with your ability to pick and find. And that's how you create. And that's what I decided to do. The art of choosing shows you how all the dilemmas associated with picking and finding. But Think Bigger goes beyond that and shows you how to take your ability to pick and find and pair that with your ability to imagine, and in so doing, create meaningful choices for yourself. It's a 6-step process, and I started teaching it formally over 10 years ago to MBA students and engineering students. Here are the 6 steps. Then I'm going to show you the core of the method. It's called choice mapping. Think of it as the alternative to just using your gut or using a brainstorming method. It's also, by the way, the underlying premise of AI and how it ideates that I believe we can do better than ChatGPT. So what is a choice map? A choice map is something where it's a tool. Think of it as a blueprint for making a choice. At the top, you define your problem. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? What's my new career option that enables me to experience this, this, and this? Then you break down the problem. What are all the things that need to be satisfied in order for me to solve my major problem? And then for each subproblem, I search far and wide for different strategies and tactics that can equally be employed to help solve each of my subproblems. And then when I need to create a solution, I take one strategy per row, line them up in my imagination, and create. That is exactly how every innovator, whether it was an artist, a scientist, an entrepreneur, created. They took different pieces, they combined them in their head, and they created something that had never been observed before. That's how I created my career. That's how you've created so many solutions to your everyday problems. What I do is I simply structure it. I make it more deliberative. I make it more transparent than a chat GPT does. And so I've been teaching people the paper and pencil method of this method. But now a number of my students have come together to create what we're calling the choice mapper. Think of the choice mapper as a much more deliberative, transparent, structured, guided way to create solutions than any chat GPT could ever do. Just as we have a GPS that replaces the map to help you get from point A to point B, but it shows you what it's doing every step of the way and why. So too, can we imagine creating an aid that would help you as you go through step by step, as you want to search, as you want to combine, as you want to gather and structure information so that you can create the choices that enables you to feel confident that yes, indeed, it is in line with who you want your authentic self to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sheena, for that really thought-provoking presentation that you just shared. Uh, and looking at some of your work, I was really found myself intrigued by the notion of choosing and making choices.
I think you're muted.
Oh, am I good? Great.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's good.
Uh,
Susan, in looking at some of my work,
yes, I was really intrigued by the notion of making choices. Uh, because of how complicated it is for us to choose what would actually satisfy us. There's so many factors, many of which that we're not even aware of that go into the choices that we make. And it seems like your map really kind of helps us to kind of narrow some of that down and sift through some of the factors.
I mean, that's my goal. In fact, over the weekend, I had somebody who was debating. There was no ideal option available for this person that was trying to figure out which job opportunity to consider. And that often happens to most of us. And I said, well, why don't we just use the think bigger method?
Yeah.
And in think bigger, we have something called a big picture scoring. And so he was able to take every option that we created, and he was able to use the big picture scoring to see which ones actually came out to be better versus worse. And he ended up being able to make a decision by Monday.
Yeah. Part of what
So we're not taking away ownership or control from the human. We're actually giving the human control.
right, right. Thank you for that. I hope you'll be able to join us toward the end as we have a much larger conversation. Another thing I'm kind of taking away from this is just that there is there's no perfect process, and we can't actually eliminate imperfection from the choices that we make. And actually, there's probably a lot of value in that. Um, that even though our choices may be imperfect, there's still something to learn and gain from it. How complex. Our next.
Absolutely. Well, as you put it, it's authenticity is not simple, it's complex.
Right, right. Thank you, Sheena.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is going to take a different crack. I'll formally introduce you to Nancy Huron. And I'm sure Nancy will be able to speak to this much better than I, but it seems in the work of historical fiction, there are a lot of choices the author has to make about what liberties to take creatively to bring the stories of history to life while accurately reflecting a historical context. There's this vital distinction between disinformation and falsifying history and telling an authentic story about real people that captures a historical context, but also does so with creativity and lure. The innovation of technology, and namely AI, surely have a role in this in the age of information, uh, where information gets around really quick. The information that is true, as well as the information that is false. How one chooses to go about writing historical fiction with tact and nuance in a time such as this, I'm sure Nancy Huron can tell us best. So let's hear a little bit about her work. Nancy Huron is the author of 3 novels, Loving Frank, written in 2007, which chronicles a little-known chapter in the life of legendary American architect Frank Lloyd Wright and his client, Mamah Borthwick Cheney. Loving Frank remained on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year. It has been translated into 16 languages and received the 2009 prize for historical fiction awarded by the Society of American Historians. The House of Lincoln, 2023, chronicles the intersecting lives of 3 families in Springfield, beginning in the 1850s. A Portuguese house girl for the Lincoln family narrates the struggle of her immigrant family and her experiences inside the home of her employer. A minister and barber in Lincoln reveals the Underground Railroad activities of his free black family. And Mary Todd Lincoln's point of view reveals her joys and profound losses over the course of her life. Culminating in the 1908 Springfield race riot, the House of Lincoln documents the Civil War and its aftermath in Abraham Lincoln's chosen hometown. The House of Lincoln is the result of the author's journey to portray a history beneath the more familiar history of Abraham Lincoln. Huron aims to understand the past by interpreting and portraying the impact of real events on the lives of real people. A native Midwesterner, Nancy Huron was a Chicago journalist before turning into fiction writer. She now lives with her husband on the island of Puget Sound. Please welcome me. Please join me in welcoming Nancy Huron.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here and such an honor to be in this place and in this room. It means a lot to me. You know, it's interesting to find myself speaking at a gathering discussing authenticity in the age of AI. I'm a historical fiction writer who has spent a considerable chunk of the last 25 years hanging out in the 19th century. My kids know that when I'm talking about the 60s, I'm talking about the 1860s, okay? The age of artificial intelligence is a foreign land to me, but so is American history as well. I am continually stunned by what I find in historical records, and I don't feel the need to concoct a strange, twisting plot. History offers that up at every turn and regularly. I've made a career by writing about real historical figures and real events, and by combining facts as the backbones of my novel and using fictional technique to bring life to the page, to bring authenticity to the landscape and to the thoughts and feelings of the characters that I portray. You heard about my novel. It is The House of Lincoln, and it explores the buildup to the Civil War, the duration of the Civil War, and the aftermath in Springfield, Illinois, which was Abraham Lincoln's chosen hometown. He lived there for 27 years, with the last 17 of which they lived in a house. He lived in a house with Mary. and it's told through the eyes of three characters: a Portuguese immigrant girl, an African-American minister and barber to Lincoln, and also Mary. And through their experiences, you get a sense of Abraham Lincoln as a husband, a father, a neighbor, as a genuine human being, as well as a politician and a lawyer. You get also a feeling of the people themselves who are telling the stories. And all of them were living in contentious times with personal and political forces bearing down on them. In writing about these people, I use my own life experiences to understand what they go through emotionally, and also the emotional experiences of friends of mine who are willing to share their lives with me. Perhaps my type will be replaced by a machine novelist someday, but at this point in the age of AI, I feel a bit smug being human. When I settle on an idea for a new novel, my office fills with books and the house fills with ghosts. We had Frank Lloyd Wright and Mamie Borthwick Cheney, his paramour, living with us for 7 years. And they were followed by Robert Louis Stevenson and his pistol-packing American wife. And they were with us for 5 years. We've had the Lincolns for 8 years. My husband feels they overstayed their visit. And he's inclined to throw them out at this moment. There are different ways to write historical fiction, but my approach is to get the history as right as I can. I'm a fiction writer who happens to love facts. And such an approach requires a deep dive into a narrow piece of history and just getting pickled, basically. I just wade in there and learn everything I can. And you know, you can really get lost, but I find my way back. Because I write about real people and real events, I want to be accurate. I feel I owe it to these people, even though they're dead. I owe it to them to get it right. And I use agreed upon facts that I find in all kinds of sources across the board, from scholarly biographies to old newspapers to letters and speeches. More than my other research projects, I found in researching the Civil War that I have come to understand in that particular piece of our history that a lot of our past has been ignored in my generation's education, or perhaps hidden from us, and in some cases entirely distorted in false narratives. And that is really what I want to talk to you about today. There are already welcome uses and great promise in artificial intelligence in medicine and other disciplines, but there's also huge concern, deep concern, about its potential to spread gravely damaging information, disinformation, that can affect the outcome of our elections and threaten American democracy. Untruths that are repeated and embraced have real consequences. There remains in our country unfinished business from the Civil War period that has contributed, I believe, to the polarization that exists today in politics in the United States. Abraham Lincoln, his cabinet, and the Union Army settled the question of slavery and set the country on a course towards social justice with Reconstruction and constitutional amendments. But the hopes for racial equality promised by President Lincoln's administration were profoundly set back by Lincoln's assassination, the backlash against Reconstruction, and also by the power of disinformation, specifically a false narrative called the lost cause. How many of you have heard of the lost cause? All right, that's a lot more people than what I get when I ask that question. It was spun after the war by Confederate officers and later expanded upon by groups in the South eager to cast the Civil War defeat in the best possible light. The narrative painted a picture of antebellum South as a romantic and genteel culture in which masters were benevolent and slaves were content. According to David Blight, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and professor of American history at Yale, the Lost Cause downplays or altogether ignores slavery as the cause of the war. It became the philosophical foundation for the racial violence and terrorism employed to reverse Reconstruction and to reimpose white supremacy. The Lost Cause narrative rose out of a grieving population in defeat, I understand, and especially the women who were widowed, who lost their husbands and their sons in that war, were grieving and wanted to honor those people. But in the process of growing the narrative of the Lost Cause, disinformation overtook facts and led to a reversal of the rights of ex-slaves that the ex-slaves had gained in the war. Some of the most fervent supporters of the Lost Cause narrative were the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who raised funds to erect statues of Robert E. Lee and other Confederate heroes. And throughout the South, also, they took an active role in shaping information about the Civil War in Southern textbooks. Black historians mounted challenges to the Lost Cause narrative as early as 1913, but the Lost Cause narrative held strong in White South's collective memory, even spreading to the North. In the past few years, as you know, the U.S. Army has changed the names of many of their posts and removed the names of Confederate generals and heroes. But the damage caused by the Lost Cause narrative reaches out in the public memory, reaches down to us today. So my inspiration in writing my book was that I grew up in Springfield, Illinois, where Lincoln lived all those years, and I thought I knew something about Abraham Lincoln. We visited the Lincoln home at 8th and Jackson when I was a kid, and we certainly learned heartwarming stories about the boy, Abe, young Abe, who would walk miles to borrow a book and that kind of thing. And then later in high school, we got a great grounding in the build-up to the Civil War and some of the battles. I believe everybody in my classrooms in high school were glad to be from a free state on the winning side of the war. There were pieces of Illinois history, however, that I did not learn until I began research for this book. Illinois entered the Union as a free state in 1818, but within 3 months of entering the Union, the legislature started formulating black laws to restrict the behavior of the free black residents in the state of Illinois. Over time, and then in 1853, the legislature tightened its codes further with an act that forbade any free black people from coming into the state of Illinois for longer than 10 days. If you stayed in the state longer than 10 days, you were subject to a $50 fine, and if you could not pay it, you could be arrested, put in jail, but then auctioned off, your labor auctioned off until you could pay the $50 fine. And so these people who were taken in, basically were returned to a form of quasi-slavery. I discovered some time ago there was another piece of Springfield history that I didn't know, that was never mentioned in any of my classes I took. 43 years after Abraham Lincoln's death, the 1908 Springfield race riot occurred when a white mob destroyed black-owned businesses and homes and lynched 2 African-American men, one of whom was Abraham Lincoln's elderly octogenarian shoemaker, William Donegan, who also had been an Underground Railroad conductor. The 3-day riot was, and Lincoln, I'm sure, didn't know that he was an Underground Railroad conductor. But the 3-day riot was a violent repudiation of Lincoln's legacy and a disgraceful mark upon the town's reputation. Over the decades, it was swept under the rug. But in recent years, the riot has become an openly acknowledged fact in the town's history as Springfield attempts to reckon with that part of its past. It struck me that what was missing in my history education were true facts about racial prejudice that did not show my home state in its best light. Misinformation comes in many forms, and omission is one of the forms. In the North, the history I learned suffered from the absence of important facts. And I really believe that had we learned about these things when I was in high school and were able to discuss it, it would have been to the benefit of everybody involved. We would be in a better place. There were other things going on in 2014. Black Lives Matter was a year into its existence. Newscasters repeated over and over again that we were a polarized nation. And some people said we were so divided we were approaching another civil war. That talk was really disturbing to me then, and it remains disturbing to me now, because I knew that in the Civil War, 750,000 soldiers died over the issue of the expansion of slavery. And that figure is larger than the total amount of deaths in all the wars that the United States has been involved in, including World War I and World War II. So I figured everybody surely knew the horror of the Civil War. And then, quite by chance, while I was doing research, I came upon a YouTube video. And there was an enterprising young woman at Texas Tech University. It could have been, by the way, any university. But she decided to go around and ask students who won the Civil War. Over and over again, nobody knew what the Civil War was, or they couldn't guess. 2 people guessed it was the Confederates who won. So it struck me it was a great time to write a historical novel about this period in history. I think people remember details better when they're in a story form. And historical fiction can help educate us and can help celebrate our strengths and confront authentic but uncomfortable truths, I think. One of the most revealing pieces of history I studied during the whole exploration, during my pickling in the history of the Civil War, was the debate between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. And that was a case where 2 Illinois politicians really argued out the issues involved that were part of this incredible buildup in the 1850s. And they were debating the issues about slavery. Lincoln was running against Douglas. It was 1858 for his seat in the U.S. Congress. And Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of debates in 7 cities around the state. And after refusing, and Lincoln would go around and just at the speeches that Douglas would give, Lincoln would just go around and pass out pieces of paper telling when he was going to talk. This was during the period so he was poaching the audience, basically, of Douglas. But he did build a reputation that way. Douglas agreed to argue out the burning issue of slavery expansion, but inevitably the discussions also turned to race and reflected the attitudes existent in a northern state. Most accounts portray Stephen Douglas as a short man with a big head of hair and a big head, and that gave him a leonine appearance, I guess. But I never came across any account of what the man was talking about. I had to learn that much later in studying history books. And what I learned is that I was astounded to find from his speeches, because I read his speeches, that this popular Northern senator from a free state was an outspoken white supremacist. He regularly expounded on race during the debates, often to the cheers of the crowd. He argued that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were written by white European men for white Europeans only, and nobody else. He enumerated who was on the out list: Native Americans, Negroes, Mexicans, Central and South Americans, and Asians, all of whom he called inferior races. This was a Northern senator making an argument that sounded a whole lot like the language of Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the new Confederacy. Stephens claimed in his famous Cornerstone speech in 1861 that the superiority of the white race was the cornerstone of the new Confederacy. The more I learned about the North at that time, the more I read old newspapers and other sources, I came to see how saturated Illinois and other northern states were with racial prejudice. Racism, sadly, was thick in the air. It turned out that Douglas won the seat, but Lincoln's arguments against slavery were wired across the country by the press and were instrumental in gaining his Republican nomination for the presidency. Reading the text of Stephen Douglas's arguments gave me a sense of what Abraham Lincoln was up against at that time. Lincoln was criticized by abolitionists for how slowly he moved on issues. He repeatedly said that he would only go as fast as the electorate was willing to go. It struck me that he knew the electorate quite well. They were not going to move fast on the issue of race, but they were willing to support Lincoln to save the Union. That was a sacred cause to them. Over time, Lincoln was changing personally. He was growing, no doubt helped along by a friendship with Frederick Douglass. The prejudices he learned as a child came into conflict for him with the promises of the Declaration of Independence. Publicly, he walked a tightrope in small steps, careful steps, bringing along followers to his thinking. He was in the throes of a lonely journey, in utter anguish over the death toll the war was taking. In time, he would add a second reason for fighting the war, and that was the emancipation. And I think of Lincoln's words when he sent his annual message to Congress on the eve of the Emancipation Proclamation. He said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." Disenthrall ourselves. Lincoln, in my view, was calling for white citizens to let go of the notions of superiority that Stephen Douglas and others embraced. The slow-moving president was operating fast near the end of his life. Lincoln was on his way to turning his full focus to Reconstruction. Sadly, he did not live long enough to see the positive effects of Reconstruction. Going forward, we don't know what the impact of AI will be on all of us. As our case is new, we must think anew. How do we protect free speech, but also disenthrall ourselves from false narratives, deep fakes, and disinformation that threatens democracy and divides us only further? It's a tall order. I can hear Lincoln's voice weigh in on the necessity of truth to sustain this democracy. He said, "I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them real facts." I sincerely hope that his beliefs hold true. But the voice of another elder, the great orator Frederick Douglass, is more cautious. He said, "We ought to have our government so shaped that even when in the hands of a bad man, we shall be safe." That strikes me as a great guiding goal not only for any government, but also for the shaping of artificial intelligence systems going forward. Thank you.
Nancy, thank you for your work and for your contributions to our dialogue this morning. It seems like there's such a balance between doing this in-depth research and also bringing in creativity and really bringing the story to life in order to tell a really unique story. Thank you. Our next speaker is a historian from Duke University, and she studies a different type of, well, stories. She studies the cultural stories we tell ourselves about success, suffering, and whether or not we're capable of change. Similar to Nancy in her exploration of the lost cause and the pain generated by disinformation, Kate is intimately familiar with the unhelpful stories we tell ourselves to make more palatable the hard truths about life. In her work, she beautifully explores how we are all instinctively lean toward paradigms that quell our fears, ease our sense of fragility, and add order to the chaos within us and the world around us, but can tragically rob us of living more authentically. During her appearance, and I mentioned to her that I was going to share this, during her appearance at the Aspen Institute Festival, Kate Bowler was actually described as having an allergy to every platitude. As someone who'd like to consider themselves an enemy to reductionism in favor of complexity and realness as a therapist, she won my admiration by that description alone. So let's hear a little bit about her work. Kate Bowler is a 4-time New York Times bestselling author, an award-winning podcast host, and an associate professor of American religious history at Duke University. She studies the cultural stories we tell ourselves about success, suffering, and whether we're capable of change. She is the author of Blessed, A History of the American Prosperity Gospel, and The Preacher's Wife, The Precarious Power of Evangelical Women Celebrities. After being unexpectedly diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at age 35, she penned the New York Times best-selling memoir, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, and No Cure for Being Human and Other Truths I Need to Hear. She has also co-written with Jessica Ritchie, Spiritual Reflections, Good Enough, 40-ish devotionals for a life of imperfection and the lives we actually have, 100 Blessings of Imperfect Days. Kate's most recent book, Have a Beautiful, Terrible Day, Daily Meditations for the Ups, Downs, and In-Betweens, is packed with bite-sized reflections and action-oriented steps to help you get through the day, be it good, bad, or totally mediocre. Kate hosts the award-winning Everything Happens podcast, where in warm, insightful, often funny conversations, talks with people like Malcolm Gladwell and Beth Moore about what they've learned in difficult times. She lives in Durham, North Carolina with her family and continues to teach do-gooders at Duke University. Please join me in welcoming Kate Bowler.
Thank you. Thanks for that kindness. Oh, hello, lovelies. This is fun. This was a fun prompt. Authenticity, Lincoln's legacy of authenticity in the age of AI, the age of brand ubiquity, the age of corporate personhood, the age of manufacturable and scalable forms of intimacy. An age in which our ability to create human-like forms of connection are multiplying. And the other day, I was having a meeting with my appointed liaison from Meta, the parent multi-billion tech company operator that gave birth to Facebook and Instagram and Threads. And I began the meeting with a firm sense that I am a professor or something. And I began to have the lingering sense partway through that I should take on a much more significant role, which is that of influencer. A horrifying description of anyone a human being, I thought, rendered as a brand in the age of the modern attention economy. A brand, they explain, is the emotional and psychological connection between you and the people consuming your content. And it is valuable to the extent to which you can manufacture emotion and shape consumer habits. And you, especially you, we, and I just point out my favorite person now, and hold the power of perception. We want you to be authentic, they say, because they always say that. And it sounds like they're telling me to be sincere, artless, transparent to the naked eye. Romantics like Ralph Waldo Emerson considered authenticity a form of spontaneous truthfulness. It was a quality that Joshua Speed attributed to his closest friend, President Lincoln. He could act no part but his own. To which I'm like, oh. And then I put it on Instagram and people were like, oh my gosh, totally. I want to be authentic in exactly that way. Authenticity is a form of congruity between our inner and our outer selves. And it is also the modern standard to which we hold ourselves. And for the last 3 centuries, first European and then American ideals have been shaped by a desire to have an authentic self, a life fully lived by the Shakespearean maxim of this above all, to thine own self be true. I don't know if anyone actually saw Keanu Reeves play Hamlet in Winnipeg, Manitoba in the year 1994. It was his like post-Speed days, and he's like, I gotta make this more serious. And he did. And I got that quote on a t-shirt I still own. But the authentic self truly is the modern self. As Tara Burton recently explored in her book Self-Made, it became the primary goal of the elite and sophisticated in Europe and the democratic and everyman in the United States. One version performs the kind of ease natural of a natural aristocrat, while the other, the gritty ambition of a try-hard bootstrapper. But all demonstrate an obsession with authenticity as the externalization of the internal life. Insides rendered as outsides. Like you impress upon others a perspective. That's the making your mark on an otherwise set of unyielding customs and cultures. So these modern versions of authenticity are much less an account of like a stable set of virtues and much more. So it's not in that way synonymous with being honest, though some is required. Neither is it necessarily about being courageous, though certainly there is some, but it is individualistic, it is experiential, and it is operational, which is to say you're not authentic in which you are performed. So we want you to be authentic, says my meta liaison, because they always say that. But it reflects a hope that I will exercise my powers of legitimation. I will perform myself. I will exercise my full powers of emotion and motivations, connect that core to an experience that my followers will have with me. After all, authenticity is the measure of the performance of your own humanity from curtains up to curtains down. I recently began writing a modern history of self-help. So I've been thinking a great deal about our ideals, our advice giving, what kind of virtues we are encouraged to embody. And so naturally, also I love spreadsheets, but I decided to read every single self-help book to hit the New York Times bestsellers list. And I've just finished the last 20 years. Because every year, billions of dollars are poured into a self-help industry defined by a theory that we can be perfected, that we can organize ourselves, budget ourselves, eat ourselves, love ourselves into a wholeness. And I mean, I just want to blame anybody who's 60 on up because, and this is every good historian should be like, it was the 1970s. But it was the 1970s, friends. And a new age strain of America's famous self-confidence took hold of the boomer counterculture. Its promises were bold and frequently metaphysical, insisting that the mind could overcome the sins of the therapeutic age, low self-esteem, mediocrity, and a ho-hum existence. Such was the flood of self-help books, and I love the poor, sweet, beleaguered New York Times. But in 1984, there were so many self-help books on the New York Times bestsellers list. They're like, just screw it, forget it. You guys get your own list. It's called self-help / advice / recipes / miscellaneous. And they're still mad about it. And you can tell they're mad about it because they won't put it in the print edition. They're like, and you can find that online or wherever losers get their books. Because they're feeling, and this is the respectability versus popular culture kind of like currents at work, but that in this genre, every good habit, self-improvement philosophy had the potential to become a fully fledged commercial enterprise. So what began as metaphysics, Louise Hay, I'm okay, you're okay, everyone's okay in this world, is now packaged as science backed with psychological expertise, lab results, clinical stamps of approval. So for the purposes of our discussion today, which is to say authenticity, the self-help industry has two fundamental arguments about what is authentic. Authenticity is progress. So in the words of Oprah, the search for your authentic self is the search that all of us hold as the pathway on our journey to become the highest version of ourselves. Authenticity is progress, and authenticity is optimization. So you're not simply recovering a deeper self, you are optimizing the deepest self. In the words of Instagram's favorite cookbook author and sermonizer Tabitha Brown, you will be most successful when you choose to be most authentic. Now, if those words sound dumb and normal to you because you've heard them a million times, I just want you to like swap out other words for the sentence, people are optimizing for success. Like we could do other stuff. We could optimize for leisure. We could optimize for quality interactions with loved ones. We could optimize for rest. But here we are pressed into always improving, always adapting for speed, efficiency, and volume. Modernity is a fever dream, promising infinite choices and unlimited progress, that we can suddenly learn to be young forever, welcome transhumanists everywhere. Elon, I hope you're getting it done. Successful forever, agents of our own perfectibility. And depending on our demographic, we can identify which brand has been catered specifically for your desires in this. Have you been influenced by a Dave Ramsey or a desire to flip a tire or two at a local CrossFit? Were you talked into, was it good dad, rich dad, poor dad, worried dad, just Mary Kay, Joyce Myers, Kim Kardashian waist trainers. American admiration for bootstrappers and optimists became a capitalistic paradise. And this is just for another day, spent my 20s interviewing televangelists, as one does. But whenever I gave those lectures, people are always like, oh, that must be so strange. Like how sad, how odd. And then, we scroll through Instagram and we realize we have all become televangelists of good, better, best. So I would like to extend the argument here, because this was a fun prompt, to think about what particular nature of optimism that we're seeing here, because we feel this desperate desire to be authentic, to perform our authenticity, but I think we are something closer to apocalyptic optimists. Because for the last 40 years, we have been staring into the bright sun of Silicon Valley's technological futurism, as the personal computer, internet, mobile phones, smartphones, cloud, social media, quantum computing, and now artificial intelligence have changed the nature of human interactions in speed, in quality, and in kind. And our obsession with self-help, self-improvement, self-optimization seems to somehow be resting on top of, but not really fully interacting with, our deep anxiety about who we are becoming as people, as communities, as nations. We have been watching the sunset of American post-war consensus liberalism for some time now, and we see its long shadows: division, confusion, new forms of conspiracy and autocracy. We are afraid. We fear that we're creeping up to the edge of environmental extinction. We worry less about the fissures in democracy that might pop up at an awkward Thanksgiving dinner conversation and more about the peaceful transfer of power. We've lost most forms of intimacy to very heavily surveilled forms of digital servitude. And sometimes late at night, we find ourselves staying up thinking about that like continent of single-use plastics, right? Floating somewhere in the ocean right now. I like doing just creepy lean-in feelings because that is exactly how I feel at 3 a.m. We long to know and to be known, but dark proxies of our authentic selves are multiplying in an age of apocalyptic optimism. And if you want to scare yourself, and I like to sometimes, feel free to just look at some of the new, this is my swiping gesture, some of the new forms of interactive AI on social media that will be available to you. Are you interested in talking to Kendall Jenner and Snoop Dogg? Congratulations, that's a new feature. You can talk to a person rendered as brand as a place of conversational ChatGPT, which is becoming increasingly personalized for our vocabulary, optimized to duplicate our tone and cadence. Pretty soon, we can have visual renderings of what. So, I recently went to a guys, philanthropies are weird, and they are so close to a hologram in which you get to talk to somebody about donor intent. But we are so close to a hologram of all of us in which we get to ask people about the meaning of life. You can ask about the usefulness of the fundamental decisions that keep your life apart. I mean, we won't need astrologers anymore. We will have endless multiplying forms of vaguely ethical digital personality proxies. And I think what's missing from our account of our apocalyptic optimism and our obsession with authenticity as self-creation is an element that shaped not only Lincoln's character, but his presidency. Our modern understanding of authenticity is entirely missing Lincoln's understanding of the tragic. He knew people like that. He lived in the first era of the self-made man. In the midst of a market revolution, towns swelling into cities, de Tocqueville's wry observations that only a new word, individualism, best suited this new nation at odds with tradition and conformity and community. That people with fortitude, scrappiness, and courage to rise were mythologized as self-made men. And though Lincoln possessed many of the golden qualities that helped him clamber up the ranks of society, it was clear by his late 20s that he could not keep easy company with them. He possessed an unshakable sadness that kept him teetering on the edge, that brink between greatness or failure. And he accumulated only greater sorrows over the course of his life. At first, his intermittent mental breakdowns and financial and political losses of his early career. But contrary to the promises of self-help, success did nothing to diminish his pain. There was, of course, the death of his son, his wife's own fragile sorrow, and then the burdens of the nation. By the summer of 1863, he wasn't thumbing through essays on self-reliance, though he had met Emerson the year before. He was rummaging around in the book of Job, searching for the words to account for the incomprehensible suffering of a war that he had come to believe was a tragic reckoning and the test of the nation's character. He was not an apocalyptic optimist, but a tragic realist. The nation's own failures had set forces in motion that might destroy them all. It had made sinners out of those who misspent their freedom and equality. Lincoln spoke of suffering as a crucible, a refining, and a reckoning. This is a true understanding of the tragic element of life. And this is why I always think all the conversations about choice are just so bizarre. Like, for the most part, we are acting in concert with forces we cannot control. And we can hear this clearly in his theological reflections of a union of divine and human will. Like, found in these papers after his death was this meditation on his awareness that both sides may be, and one must be, wrong. And I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it should not end yet. By his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without any human contest, yet the contest began. And this is the bit where it always leaves us. Even so, he wrote elsewhere, we must work earnestly in the best light God gives us. I love that, like, the even so-ness of anyone's mature thought. We see in Lincoln that suffering is necessary where there is no help for it, and that we must act in the light of our own undoings. And let's remember the last president who said that in modern history. Remember, this is Jimmy Carter's infamous malaise speech and how popular that made him. We don't like it when presidents tell us the truth. That we can't simply talk about progress, because we will forget all that we learned when we are unmade. Which brings us back to where we started. Our age of optimization, our age of high anthropology, our transcendent account of the American dream made flesh, or at least made chatbot. If a machine can always improve, always optimize, always progress, what does that say about us? Should we become more like the technology that we are creating? And then in the face of our own limitations, our quirks, our faults, our suffering, our humanity, does that make us flawed machines? Are there actually some forms of truth-telling that can only come from our limitations, our faults, our quirks, our suffering, our humanity? I like to think there is. I think it is a certain kind of wisdom. There's a lovely line from Lincoln biographer Joshua Wolfshank about what Lincoln learned from being both a player and a pawn, an actor and a victim of what Martin Heidegger has a lovely phrase. He calls it the thrownness of life. But he called wisdom, the wisdom that Lincoln possessed, a, quote, delicate fruit of a lifetime of pain. Australian musician Nick Cave is best known for being the frontman of this, one of America's most enduring rock bands. Well, not America's, the world's most enduring rock bands of all time, the Bad Seeds. And he has a similar wisdom, so I'd like to close with that. His reflections on authenticity in the age of AI. So you've probably heard, and it's fun for parties, but ChatGPT can replicate in the style of, if you put any poet, author, etc., which is very fun, which is to say you input that person's content, and it begins to then generate according to vocabulary and typically meter. So Nick Cave started getting all this fan mail in which people began to send him new songs written in the style of Nick Cave. And they thought it was a tribute. He thought it was a travesty. These forms of artificial intelligence, he argued, could perhaps even, quote, in time create a song that is on the surface indistinguishable from the original, but it will always be a replication, a kind of burlesque. Why? You see, Nick had lost his 15-year-old son. So when artificial intelligence is given the task to write as Nick, which is to say, compile his language and shape his vocabulary around a task to write something like, write a song about a boy, what could it say? Nick was a man marred by tragedy, a man composed by, quote, tiny trembling clusters of atoms, subsumed with grief's awesome presence. It occupies the core of our being and extends through our fingers to the limits of the universe. And this, I think, is the system error at the heart of our account of optimization. And I think we can hear it in Nick in language that really echoes C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, which still counts anguish as a precious gift. Our apocalyptic optimism cannot tell the whole truth about who we are, because there are certain forms of truth-telling, emotional congruity, and authenticity that require an intimate knowledge of the tragic. Because without the tragic, we cannot sing a song, argued Nick. because songs, quote, are predicated upon the complex internal human struggle of creation. And well, as far as I know, algorithms don't feel, data doesn't suffer. ChatGPT has no inner being. It has been nowhere. It has endured nothing. It has not the audacity to reach beyond its limitations, and hence it does not have the capacity for a shared transcendent experience, as it has no limitations from which to transcend. So authenticity as optimization, authenticity as progress, as success. Well, without authenticity as limitation, suffering, quirks, humanity, we cannot show empathy, that powerful antidote to cynicism or disgust, if we have not felt the initial failings of our own emotional imagination. We cannot learn courage without that gnawing fear that nothing can be different until it is. We could never write a eulogy. We can write an obituary. We can rehearse a person's accomplishments. We can report who they left behind. But we can't know what Ogden Nash says in this beautiful poem, what an old man knows when an old man dies. Or in the words of Rabbi Steve Leder, that the beauty of a flower is that it fades. So can we have authenticity in the age of AI? The trajectories of our technologies can likely scale our positive emotions, our goodwill, our easy wisdom, our cliches. Those are maximizable forms of intimacy, but it will require less and less of the texture of our humanity. How we know our days by our nights, why we know the claim of each life upon us because of the gnawing fear that we will someday make do without them. Puttering along toward the future, knowing what lays behind us. All right, my lovelies, that's my sad talk. We're done today.
That was wonderful, Kate. Thank you so very much.
Yep.
I love this notion of how authenticity has evolved into kind of optimization and progress and this performance of humanity, and also this self creation, and how there's such anxiety really about what we're performing and what we're actually becoming, especially as AI looms so large in the background of our lives and these changes that we're seeing every single day. They're present even if we're not really thinking about them. You also mentioned this notion of truth telling that can only come from really our limitations, our experience of maybe what's playing out in the background, the things that we can't actually perfect, and the genuine limitations that may bring about suffering, but authentic experience nonetheless. I think it's fitting, actually, that we transition to hearing from an artist, a multi-hyphenate artist, I'd call her. Kaylee Bryant Greenwell, her work helps us explore how we engage with a myriad of emotions through art, through what's evoked in us when we're viewing art. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Kaylee a couple of months ago as one of the members of our working group that I mentioned earlier today. And I can personally attest to her creativity and brilliance and what she brings into every room that she shares. I'll share a little bit more about her work. Kaylee Bryant Greenwell is a native of Washington, D.C., with over 13 years of experience in museums, higher ed, and nonprofit art spaces, where she has utilized social justice practices to enhance audience engagement. Before joining the Aspen Institute in 2023 as Senior Program Manager of the Arts Program, she served as the Associate Director of Outreach and Operations with the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University. She launched the center's new branding, including social media campaigns and issues-focused toolkits for non-academics, and developed strategies and architecture for new community-based projects. Prior to that role, she served as the inaugural I know that word, community engagement specialist with the Smithsonian American Art Museum. and created new opportunities to sustain thought partnership and shared authority with BIPOC communities. As head of public programs with SAAM, she led an extensive portfolio of programs across 2 museums and led new outreach and inclusion initiatives toward developing new audiences and cultivating meaningful public engagement. She has built and launched numerous new programming initiatives at the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum, Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the National Museum of Women in the Arts, among others. Kaylee has previously served on the board of Washington Project for the Arts, on the selection committee for V's Arts, and led the DC chapter for Art Table. Additionally, she participates in the museum as site for social action and the empathetic museum movements. She has written and published extensively on change-making in museums. Please join me in welcoming Kaylee Bryant Greenwell.
As long as invention and feeling constitute essential qualities in a work of art, this technology can never assume a higher rank than copying. This technology lacks that refined feeling and sentiment which animate the productions of a man of genius. This technology cannot qualify as art because it lacks something beyond mere mechanism at the bottom of it. This technology could never claim the homage of higher forms of art because in the actual production of the work, the artist ceases and the technology takes its place. Once this technology has been perfected and made common enough, the painter will have nothing more to do. And of course, these art critics mirror our own concerns regarding the technology we've gathered here to discuss today, the invention of photography. Photography was invented in Lincoln's early teen years in 1822. And though it remained a fledgling technology in the few decades thereafter, many artists and art critics still saw it as a threat almost a century later. The artist Henrietta Klopath said in a 1901 issue of Brush and Pencil, "The fear has sometimes been expressed that photography would in time entirely supersede the art of painting." The first photography art exhibit was met with hearty criticism, ranging from overall aesthetic displeasure to denying the medium as a valid art form. On first seeing a photograph around 1840, the painter Paul Delarouche announced, "From today, painting is dead." Until this time, painting was the undisputed juggernaut of art. Painting was revered as one of the highest forms of creation. It was respected and valued at the highest point in the hierarchy of creativity. It was also believed, until that point, to be unthreatened by any other form of art. And now, the onset of the photograph threatens to topple the great painting, essentially jeopardizing the entirety of the art hierarchy. Because painting is an endeavor of the mastered hand, and photography was entirely generated by a device, the critical majority saw photography merely as a thoughtless mechanism for replication. I want us to hold that particular assessment. A thoughtless mechanism for replication. We'll return to that. I gathered this historic backlash to ground us in a social continuum as we consider the multidimensional concerns of AI, art, and authenticity. Repulsion, fear, dismissal, belittling, these are all long-standing, duplicative rebuttals to the new, which is to say, these attitudes are deeply human. Even still, they are short-sighted. I mean this in the most literal definition of the term. Our immediate reaction to change, to the new, to the unknown, can only see so far. In the spirit of embracing some of Lincoln's most audacious ideas, let's try to see a bit farther. Continuing with the lessons of the invention of photography and the continuum of human artistic experience we are now exploring with AI, I want to recognize what happened next, what happened after the knee-jerk reactions. Gallerist and historian Louis K. Meisel notes this: the invention of photography in the 19th century had three effects on art. First, portrait and scenic artists were deemed inferior to the photograph, and many turned to photography as careers. Second, it was well documented that artists used the photograph as source material and as creative aid. However, they went to great lengths to deny that fact, fearing that their work would be misunderstood as imitations. And third, through the photograph's invention, artists were open to a great deal of new experimentation. So we have 1, contentious attitudes determining new criteria for the valuation of art. 2, a new tool for artists to utilize. And 3, new ways of experimenting in creative forms. Ultimately, the culmination of the invention of the photograph is recognized as a break in art's activity and the challenge facing the artist, from the earliest known cave drawings, trying to replicate our visible reality. Because we now had a medium that could document reality, artists had the freedom to explore new modes and eventually turned to abstraction, at least in the Western trajectory of art history. Understanding the development of art as a continuum, we can draw a straight line from the technological invention of the abhorrent photograph to the creative invention of abstraction. Staying on this continuum for just another moment, after a century of abstraction, in the 1960s and 70s, we meet a group of experimenters who create photorealism, a painting approach that uses the photograph as source material and seeks to perfectly replicate the likeness of said photograph, producing paintings that appear photographic. This trajectory paints an ultimately positive journey that we might be tempted to call full circle. But of course, we know that the story of photography does not end in the 60s. Each of us has a device in our pockets with an exponentially progressive, ever improving camera, testifying to the constant evolution of technological advancement. But what this historic truth does beg us to consider is that in just the course of a little over 100 years, we boast an artistic chain that returns to further entangle and expand our thinking about photographic documentation. What will AI-generated art provoke in the same time span? Or more likely, because our technologies advance at exponential rates, what will AI-generated art spur within a quarter of that time span? Now that we've grounded our discussion of AI in art within history and understanding human reactions, we can unpack the fears, concerns, realities, and perceptions of AI within a context relevant to where we've been
and where we might actually be going. We know what's true. We know what's true. I'm seeing some discomfort and uncertainty in the crowd with this statement. It's no wonder that in a society bombarded with differing narratives developed by fellow humans, that if we can't confidently say we know what's true, then of course throwing non-human narratives into the mix gives us pause. But as we experience on a daily basis, we can't stay on pause forever. The world will move forward, whether we're ready to join it or not. I know this from experience. I have always been a technology skeptic. I'm what's called a late adapter. I've never been the first to accept a newly launched technology. In fact, I only joined Twitter as a mandatory assignment in my grad school museums and technology class. In my very first tweet, I very sarcastically stated, well, now I'm on Twitter, I guess I'll get all the museum job opportunities now. That was in 2011. Twitter launched 5 years earlier in 2006. In fact, the job opportunities did not immediately start rolling in with that one, so I wasn't entirely wrong, though perhaps my sarcasm was ill-advised. But I was wrong to assume that Twitter would be a complete waste of my time. As I began to use the platform with a more open mind, I found a robust community of museum professionals invested in making museums more inclusive. Prior to its transformation into X, Twitter proved to not only be useful in a professional sense, but also stimulating and collaborative. When I began my research on AI in art at my work in Aspen, initially I was saying, we have to find solutions because AI isn't going anywhere. AI isn't going anywhere. My research brought up such public sentiments toward AI, particularly AI-generated art, as repulsion, rejection, even abject horror. There are many sides to this particular coin, many of which argue for the discrediting of AI in art, dismissing it as an invalid form of creation, a thoughtless mechanism for replication. There's that phrase again. After months of research, I've reframed my original purpose statement to this work as, we have to find solutions because AI is only getting bigger, not going away, not staying present, definitely not staying contained, getting bigger, rapidly. So what do we need to prepare ourselves for an ongoing reality with AI? How do we come to terms with where we've been and where we're going? It's been said that humans, and perhaps humans alone, make two things, tools and art. While it is widely accepted that animals make and use tools, it is still massively debated whether animals truly make art, or if they are simply in the act of a thoughtless mechanism for replication. How we define the production of tools and art comes into play here. What is a tool? Generally speaking, a device that aids in accomplishing a task. Surely this simple definition could be debated for accuracy, but we're probably not going to find too much controversy in what defines a tool. So what is art? Merriam-Webster Online tells us the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. By this definition, an entity creating art must have consciousness, utility, skill, and creative imagination. Consciousness, utility, skill, and creative imagination. In a 2023 study published in the Journal of Computers and Human Behavior titled Defining Humankind, Anthropocentric Bias in the appreciation of AI art. University researchers aim to understand our worldviews of AI and art. Throughout 4 experiments, they consistently found a pervasive bias against AI-made works and sought to understand the psychological underpinning as to why. In an art exhibit featuring works made by humans and AI with labels denoting which is which, the same artwork is preferred less when labeled as AI made versus human made because it is perceived as less creative and subsequently includes less awe, an emotional response typically associated with the aesthetic appreciation of art. Furthermore, these effects are more pronounced among people with stronger anthropocentric creativity beliefs, i.e., who believe that creativity is a uniquely human characteristic. Systematic depreciation of AI-made art and the assignment of lower creative value and possible suppression of emotional reactions appears to serve a shaken anthropocentric worldview whereby creativity is exclusively reserved for humans. Or, in other words, AI-made art threatens our humanity. Socially, culturally, we are adding the qualifier that art must be a product of human consciousness, utility, skill, and creative imagination, which would provoke us to dismiss the apes that appreciate the stones they collect and display in terms of color, shape, and weight. How can we appreciate this rather beautiful and expansive truth if humans, and humans alone, hold the monopoly on what is authentic in art? And if it is true that non-humans are just as valid in their pursuit of art as us, how are we supposed to feel about creation made in the absence of feeling? Consciousness, utility, skill, and creative imagination doesn't necessarily demand feeling, emotion. But do we demand emotion in art? The dichotomy of what humans make, tools, and art further complicates our perceptions of AI and art because we must now contend with what does it mean for a tool to not just be useful in the creation of art, but the creator itself. But this isn't actually a new complication. At the onset of the information age in the post-war era, the late Father John Culkin voiced one of the late philosopher and father of media studies, Marshall McLuhan's greatest ideas. We become what we behold. We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. Another quote that has shaped our modern thinking about creation is, "Art is a lie that tells a truth." But actually, the full quote by Picasso presents us with a more comprehensive reality to grapple with. Quote, "We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie that makes us realize truth, at least the truth that is given us to understand. The artist must know the manner whereby to convince others of the truthfulness of his lies. I would like to know if anyone has ever seen a natural work of art. Nature and art, being two different things, cannot be the same thing. Through art, we express our conception of what nature is not." End quote. In this framework, we must ask ourselves, what invalidates AI-generated creation from being art? Art need not and is not a product of nature, or even of reality for that matter. Art is not even purely a product of truth. So what is art? I do want to note that in relevance to Lincoln, and more specifically to the work being done here at the Cottage, I find it suitable to consider Picasso's insights, despite the increasing public awareness around his problematic behaviors, specifically his misogyny. Not because we, as an increasingly more aware public, may set aside those objections, but the Cottage encourages us to take our great thinkers off of the pedestal, to view them critically from a 360-degree perspective, and to challenge ourselves to hold difficult, sometimes opposing truths together as a holistic worldview. In 2020, Studio Ghibli, the creative studio of the masterful animated film director Hayao Miyazaki, lifted its years-long ban from allowing its impressive catalog of films to be accessed via streaming services. Then Miyazaki used the profits from said formerly banned streamers to fund his next film, the first in nearly a decade, titled The Boy and the Heron, which won Best Animated Picture in this year's Academy Awards. This is not another lesson of an acclaimed artist being wrong. This is a lesson in what we potentially miss out on when we continuously deny ourselves the unknown. Of course, hindsight will always be a more perfect vision, that we can see a more perfect vision than what we can see in our immediate present. And without a doubt, not all reactionary fear is foiled. Let me be clear. Many, many, many of the concerns around AI are completely valid. Perhaps even some mild panic is justified, particularly around the issues of deep fakes and voting systems legitimacy. But I am not yet convinced that all, or particularly any, of the vehemently dismissive reactions towards AI and art are prompting a revelatory mindset. So then the billion-dollar question is, what do we need to trust AI? But perhaps a more fruitful place to start is, what can artists teach us about trusting AI? Artists can help us get from reactions to new actions. Through a variety of critical provocations, many artists of color are raising our collective consciousness on inherent biases, often racial biases, in AI-generated imagery. Artist Stephanie Dinkins, a Black woman, spotlights her interactions asking AI to produce images of Black women that regularly result in machine distortions and mangle facial features and hair textures. Senegalese artist Linda Douina Ribiez proved how AI misrepresents people of color in an interview with the New York Times. She asked OpenAI's image generator, DALL-E 2, to imagine buildings in her hometown of Dakar. Instead of capturing the beauty of the coastal capital of Senegal, the AI produced images of arid desert landscapes and ruined buildings. Artists have always used their creativity to construct, deconstruct, and complicate our sense of reality. This is something that I believe in deeply, because the arts program at the Aspen Institute champions the role of artists and cultural leaders as critical thought leaders, futurists, and change makers. We need artists at the table as we collectively resolve our greatest challenges. As for the challenge of AI, art, and authenticity, we are circling around the dilemma of nostalgia and grief. This is another great experiential notion that the Cottage is also shared throughout different iterations of Aspen ideas. That grief is difficult, but a necessary part of life. A note of hope from Aspen Ideas in Miami Beach last month. Fiction writer C. Pam Zhang, author of The Land of Milk and Honey, which was longlisted for the 2024 Aspen Words Literary Prize, said this: "Grief allows us to put a stop to nostalgia. It makes us look at the time we had and mourn it and then move on. But nostalgia keeps us consumed with what is lost. We are consumed with nostalgia when we succumb to knee-jerk reactions. We must remember that we didn't lose painting with photography. We won't lose art with AI." Thank you.
Let's continue around. Thank you so much, Kaylee. That was just brilliant. So many riveting notions in what you shared. I am mindful of our time. We only have but a couple of minutes. Do we have time for a couple of questions from our audience? Great. So we'll just quickly transition over into our community conversation, and we'd like to hear from you. There, I believe, are some folks. I think Cameron's going to come around with the microphone, and share that with you should you have a comment to raise. But we want to hear, like, what things are you wrestling with? What concepts are you thinking about, find yourself mulling around as you've heard our conversation today? There's so many different topics. Yeah, please. And why don't you share your name with us?
My name is Kathleen O'Reilly. I want to thank all of you. This was one of the most brilliant, thought-provoking 2 hours that I've had in a long, long time.
Wonderful.
And what occurs to me is the word fear is almost a chain through all of your topics. Fear as a root of a lot of racism. Fear is the yearning for self-help. Fear is part of grieving. And I wonder if there are lessons we can learn from Abraham Lincoln, who certainly dealt with fear, and whether or not you see a unifying theme there that brings all of these various disciplines together, but also gives us in Abraham Lincoln a model on how we might deal with this.
I think that's a wonderful question. Is anyone from the audience want to react to that? Does any one of our speakers want to also chime in? I can certainly say that. Oh, would you like to?
Yeah, my name is Mary Prochnow, and yeah, there's a double-edged sword, I feel, with fear. It's either, it could be both unifying and divisive, but I guess it's action-oriented, perhaps. So that's my comment relative to the fear issue.
Thank you. Anyone else? I think what I was simply going to ask, I was really going to resonate with your comment. I truly agree. I think fear was a common theme, and we never get rid of stress. We never get rid of fear. We never get rid of that sense of bracing about the unknown or uncertainty. But someone mentioned courage earlier, and courage certainly isn't the absence of fear, but it's the willingness to live alongside it in a way that allows us to still live fully. So I hold on to the notion of courage as maybe a guiding light through all of this, while we still deal with the fear that's inevitable.
Thank you. Thank you. Am I using this correctly? Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm yelling in the ears of people and saying sorry. I just wanted to thank everyone for this incredible conversation, and Justin for your moderating and the Cottage for hosting it. One of the things for me that I've reflected on about fear over the years, and I think in the context of this conversation, is that fear is such a human emotion. And there's not something wrong with fear. Fear is instructive. We feel fear because we love something, because we're worried about something being hurt, something being lost. That is so wise emotion. And that one of the things that we also have that I heard echoed in what was shared today is that as human beings, we have felt fear for as long as we've been around. And we just keep getting up and loving, and the sun rises, and we're hungry, and we want food, and we want connection. And that equal to that fear is that courage and is that capacity to rise to whatever comes and to the unknown. That we live short-sighted in the immediacy, but we also live over the course of whatever comes, and we have that capacity to respond to it. And I say to my children often, they're in their 20s, and they're like, well, what's the world going to look like in 10 years? And we don't know. But what we do know is that every single human being who's alive is descended from people who lived through the impossible, somehow survived, woke up one morning, and chose to keep living and loving. And so that lives inside of us and inside of each person who's alive. And that we'll do that until the end comes for each of us individually or for us collectively. And that's where, whether it's AI, whether it's the climate, whether it's everything, this is what it means to be human. It means to be scared out of our wits and capable of showing up and doing what needs to be done until we can't.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that beautiful comment. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions? Thanks, Karen.
Hi, my name's Allison Weber. This is really just kind of an observation. Throughout all of this, I'm having this chicken egg argument going on in my head. You talk about empathy and courage and how that makes the difference. When we cease to value those things, this vacuum is created for AI to take over, it seems to me. So which comes first, I guess, is just kind of my observation. Did we allow this to happen by devaluing these things? Probably a combination of both, but that's just something that all of your comments got me thinking about.
I saw some folks reacting to that. Anyone else want to share? It's an interesting notion. I do think there's something in us that we're led to create, we're led to innovate. There's something in us that I think drives us to do more. And as some folks talked about, right, like technology, there's such a trade-off, right? There's the convenience of that innovation affords us, but then we never really erase the human part of it, right? The human to human contact. Are we starting to devalue that? I think we're starting to realize that we're losing it in some capacity, and we need to do everything that we can to hang on. I'd like to think like what we did today was kind of an effort toward that, to be in this room together and have this conversation about what it means to authentically be human. We have some hands in the back.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Bartlett, and thank you for the conversation. Back here, sorry. Thank you for the conversation today. I really enjoyed the panel, and I'm thinking about here, particularly from the lens that I think we're all trying to hold from Lincoln, is thinking about the policy perspective in this, and thinking about how to protect fear or to bring courage in the face of fear. Lincoln bringing policies and bringing forward things that help shepherd and guide that. I'm just wondering, for our conversation here, how policy always continues to lag where we all are trying as we're engaging with these tools and AI, and just where we hope maybe from y'all at the panel's perspective, hope policy can catch up.
Did you guys read that article this weekend about, it was a New York Times article about the rate of consumption of AI and how they're going to run out of words to consume as they aggregate this. Take a look, take a gander. And that like Google thought about buying, I think it was Google thought about buying Simon and Schuster. And so on the policy issue, just as all those of us who make things, I think one of the sharpest curbs to this aggregation monster. I mean, and they've started using our Google Docs. I mean, all of our words are being taken from us, all of our creativity without our permission. We're trying to put on Jessica and I are trying to put on an event in a couple months in Indianapolis, and it's going to take us months to just get the permission for a nice singer to sing a couple songs. And I think like they're entirely skipping any of the permissions process because they know consent is will never be given at that scale. And so I think intellectual property sounds like one of the strongest arguments for our humanity, but we have to move very quickly because, I mean, they'll scoop it up long before rendering all of our protests moot, I suppose. Just another thrilling deep dive into my mind. Sorry.
One more comment before we wrap up. Okay, I really want to thank you all for the time that we spent together this morning. There's just so many just interesting concepts that we dialogued about. I want to encourage us all to just embrace non-disclosure and the spirit of unfinished work, the unfinished work that Lincoln had as he left this room for the final time, and the unfinished work that we all have in living alongside fear, embracing our humanity, and doing what needs to be done in our individual lives. Thank you all. And I'm going to pass it over to Callie to just share some final words and close us out.
Thank you, Justin. I just want to take one more second to run over here for the camera. One more second to thank everybody for coming. Thank you to our incredible speakers. Justin, you were a masterful moderator. Cameron and I knew it. So we're so delighted that you would join us. And Kate and Nancy and Sheena and Kaylee, my dear friend Kaylee, this was so special. And I agree with you. This is, I think, one of the most special programs we've ever done. Thank you again to our team here at President Lincoln's Cottage, Joan and Haley and Cameron and Molly and Hannah and Josie and Paul. And I see so many people, Emma, everybody, we're a small team. And so programs like this really call on everybody from all areas of our site to put on. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you all so much. I also, every time I'm in here, I'm just struck by the dual happenings of this room. Lincoln crafted the Emancipation Proclamation according to all of the oral histories, and it's also his bedroom. We didn't mention that before. This was the room where he and Mary retreated, I imagine, especially in that first season that they lived out here, late at night to grieve the death of their little boy, which was one of the causes that brought them out here. And so when I say that triumph and tragedy really do coexist in all of these spaces, I think it's felt so powerfully in this very room. And I also think that this is a space where Lincoln was so deeply human. And I thank you all for showing up today in all of your humanity and bringing all of your thoughts and your ideas and perspectives. This is what makes us better. And I think this is exactly the kind of thing that we have to focus on in the next 6, 9 months and years ahead. So thank you all so much. A few final thoughts. If you are interested in becoming members, we have a table set up just outside the door. You can also purchase books. We have a copy of Sheena's book here. Kate has pre-signed copies of her book, and Nancy is going to be signing books, I believe, right outside. So please purchase some books. Your purchases also help support us here at President Lincoln's Cottage and will help you take home some of the wonderful ideas that you heard here today. So thank you all so much for coming. Please, if you haven't come for tours, please do that. We also have a program coming up in May 18th and 19th, called Bourbon and Bluegrass. So if you like either one of those things, it is a wonderful, wonderful 2-day just activity full of lots of great music, great drinks, and lots of good company. So thank you all so much for coming.